Today, I want to share with you some scratch-made recipes for breakfast, lunch, and dinner for those days when you have a little bit more time on your hands. Over the last few days, I've been sharing a lot of content on YouTube and on my blog that are really focused on efficiency in the kitchen and in scratch cooking. But on this particular day, I had a little bit more time on my hands, so I wanted to make some foods that my family loves and make them solely from scratch. I am starting the day off with some homemade einkorn waffles and some pepper bacon that we cured and smoked at home. I'll show you how to make homemade bacon in just a minute, but for the waffles, I am using fresh milled einkorn flour. So if you don't have a grain mill, you can get einkorn flour at the store or online, or you can just use whatever flour you have on hand in your pantry. For these waffles, I am mixing together 3 cups of fresh milled einkorn flour unsifted. I've really been enjoying keeping the bran and the germ in my fresh milled flour, but you could definitely sift it if you prefer. 1 tablespoon of baking powder, a 1/4 cup of maple syrup, a 1/2 teaspoon of salt, a little sprinkle of cinnamon, 2 eggs, a 1/2 cup of coconut oil. You can definitely leave the coconut oil out if you prefer. I did that accidentally the last time I made these and they were really good. My husband actually likes them better without the coconut oil, so feel free to leave that out. And then I'm adding in 2 cups of whole milk and 2 teaspoons of homemade bourbon vanilla. I am new to milling my own flours, and what I have found is that they are pretty thirsty, especially if you don't sift them. So this batter is a little thin at first, but if you let it sit for a minute, it will absorb more of the liquid. I recently got a cast iron waffle iron because my electric one broke, like they all have broken over the years, so I want one that will just stand the test of time. I really like making waffles in this, but there is a little bit of a learning curve. Of course, every stove and every cook and every waffle batter is different, but what I found through a bit of trial and error, including one waffle that was so stuck it took about an hour to get out of the waffle iron, is that first preheat both sides of the waffle iron. So let it preheat for about 5 minutes on one side, then 5 minutes on the other. Spray it with a nonstick spray, like an avocado spray, and then cook it on both sides for about 2 minutes. It is a little bit messy. Sometimes the steam in the oil escapes, but the trade-off is the most beautiful golden crispy pancake ever. Now, to talk about the bacon, we need to take a field trip to about 10 days ago when I started curing this pork belly at home to make a homemade pepper cured bacon. This recipe will soon be on my blog over at moonandmagnolia.com, but I'm simply making a rub with salt, brown sugar, black pepper, paprika, and celery juice powder. Okay, so here's where things start to get a little bit controversial about bacon. So nitrates, according to many studies, are not very good for you. So an alternative is celery powder. Celery powder does contain natural nitrates, and people have a lot of mixed feelings about whether or not these celery plant-based nitrates are good for you or not. So I have chosen to use celery juice powder for the nitrate portion of this recipe. I'm not a food scientist, I'm not a nutritionist, I'm not a healthcare professional, so I don't really like to get into the details of what's good for you and what isn't. You can take a little time and figure out if you want to use pink curing salt, which is a more traditional nitrate used for bacon, or if you'd rather use celery juice powder. But in this case, I am using celery juice powder. Whether or not you are using pink curing salt for your nitrates or celery juice powder, nitrates add that classic bacon flavor to your pork belly, and they also prevent unwanted bacterial growth and botulism during the curing process. So I'm just putting the rub on both sides of the pork belly and then putting it in a 2-gallon Ziploc bag and sticking it in the fridge. We'll get to that in a second. But this is about 7 pounds of bacon that I got for $30. The average pack of bacon at the grocery store, if you want the quote uncured kind, is about $10 for 12 ounces. So this is so much cheaper and it tastes way better than anything you can get at the store. So the pork belly is in the fridge, and every 12 to 24 hours, whichever one is more feasible for me, I'm going to flip the pork belly over. And that allows all the juices and those flavors to marinate all sides of the pork belly. Now, you might see some people square up the pork belly before they cure it. I actually like to square it up later after we smoke it. So that way the meat gets all those flavors from the seasonings and the curing and even the smoking. And when we trim off the fat and square up the edges, then all that meat has some delicious flavor to add into things like soups and baked beans and those sorts of things. So what's nice about this is, yes, you get bacon, but you can also trim the fat and use some of the edges for other recipes too, so nothing goes to waste. It is 7 days later, and I am getting ready to rinse off the rub and smoke the pork belly. So you can see here that the salt and the seasonings pulled the liquid out of the meat and created sort of like a marinade, but that's actually how the pork belly is preserved. That's the curing process. It pulls the liquid out of it so that way it can last longer. So even though I think most of the time we don't think of bacon as a preserved food necessarily, making bacon is a form of preserving pork belly. So first you just rinse the rub off, then let the pork belly soak for about 15 minutes or 30 minutes while you get the smoker ready. And then my husband smoked this at about 200, 220 degrees until it reaches an internal temperature of 150 degrees Fahrenheit. And then you simply just slice it against the grain. Now, we do not have a meat slicer. We actually just ordered one today because this would be a lot easier with the meat slicer, but you can definitely use a knife. It's just hard to get a really thin cut. But here we are now 10 days later in the future, back with our waffles and bacon, and I am making this bacon to accompany my Einkorn waffles. And then I covered everything in a little bit of butter, and then I drizzled on some homemade molasses pancake syrup. That recipe is actually over on my blog too. It's delicious. And from top to bottom, this was a scratch-made breakfast. When I was making the bacon, I had mentioned that you can use the trimmings from the pork belly for things like baked beans, and that is exactly what I am doing for lunch today. I am making a homemade pork and beans or homemade baked beans with a side of smoked chicken. To speed up the process, I made a pound of navy beans in the Instant Pot. So I just put the dry beans in there with 8 cups of water, some olive oil, and a bay leaf, and I cooked them for about 25 minutes. And while that is cooking, I am chopping up the large chunks of the pork belly that my husband trimmed off just to square up the piece of meat. And then I am putting this right into my cast iron Dutch oven and letting the fat render out. It takes a few minutes for these thicker pieces. If you have thinner pieces of bacon, it won't really take that long. But once the fat starts to render, I am then adding in some peppers that I chopped up. Really, I recommend using green peppers. I just forgot to get some, and I have these little snacking peppers for my daughter, so I'm just using those. And then some onions that I already had chopped up and ready to go. As the fat continues to render and the veggies soften, I am making a really simple sauce. This is about a half a cup of ketchup. I really didn't measure that much. I used measuring cups, but it was pretty loose. A quarter cup of molasses, a quarter cup of brown sugar, and a quarter cup of maple syrup. And then I threw in a little bit of salt, some mustard, and apple cider vinegar. I think if I were to make this again, I'd cut back just a little bit on the sweetness. I'd probably take some of the brown sugar out. I mean, it was good, don't get me wrong, but it's definitely a sweeter style of baked bean. One of the things to keep in mind about this recipe is once you mix the sauce together, it then has to go in the oven for about 2 to 3 hours. So if you want to make this for lunch, I do recommend starting it earlier in the day because this is not a super fast recipe. It is definitely very easy, but it does take some time. Now, once I'm getting that sauce in there, it does need to be thinned a little bit. I didn't measure how much water. I would eyeball that if I were you because it really depends on your ingredients, but add a little bit of water if necessary to thin it. The beans are done in the Instant Pot, so I am simply just transferring some of them into the sauce mixture. I did not measure how much I put in there. I just used a slotted spoon to drain the liquid, and then I eyeballed what I thought looked good. So it was probably a little more than half of the beans in the Instant Pot. I baked this for 2 hours at 300 degrees Fahrenheit, and after 2 hours, it was definitely done. The sauce had thickened a lot. In fact, so much that I added added a little bit of water just to rehydrate it a little bit. And adding the water made it the perfect consistency for baked beans. So if yours gets a little bit too thick, don't worry, a little water will fix it. When my husband smoked the pork belly, he also smoked a bunch of chicken breasts and we sliced them up and froze them. So I thawed the chicken breast quickly in a bowl of hot water and we had homemade baked beans and home smoked chicken for lunch. For dinner, we are having a homemade pasta made on a gnocchi board and cream sauce. And here I am back with my grain mill again, and this time I am milling some hard red winter wheat. For pasta, you would probably want to use seminola or durum flour, but I don't have any. I'm having a hard time sourcing some of these grains because Azure Standard, who has the best prices, doesn't deliver here. So right now I'm just kind of using what I have. But in any case, I am mixing together the flour with some warm water and olive oil, and then I am kneading it on a floured surface. Now, I will say I had to add a bit of all-purpose flour to this just to make it less sticky. Not sure where I went wrong there, but by adding the all-purpose flour, it ended up being a perfect pasta dough. So once I kneaded it for about 8 to 10 minutes or so, I am wrapping it up in plastic and setting it aside for about 30 minutes to an hour. Really, the longer the better, about up to 3 hours. About a month ago, I took a pasta making class and we made pasta using a gnocchi board, which was game changer. It makes pasta so easy. You don't need a KitchenAid stand mixer. You don't need any fancy equipment. You just need a gnocchi board. And I got this really beautiful gnocchi board from a friend and my husband's coworker who makes custom woodworks. So all you do is roll the dough out, cut it into small pieces, and then run it across the gnocchi board, and it leaves these beautiful designs in it, but those designs also hold the sauce. So not only does it have an aesthetic quality about it, it also has a functional one. For the sauce, I am using homemade herb butter that I made with herbs from my garden earlier in the spring. I actually have a link for that also on my blog. I will leave that in the description box below. But this is a really easy way to add some flavor and fresh herbs into your food. And then of course, I'm adding in some pre-chopped onions and letting that saute. Then I'm also putting the pasta into a pot of boiling water. And while that cooks, I am deglazing the pan with some white wine. And then I'm also adding in some garlic powder. You could use fresh garlic. I was just feeling a little lazy at this time of day. And then some heavy cream. Fresh pasta does not take long to cook. So once the noodles start to float, I just test a couple and make sure they are done. These were al dente, which is how I wanted it because then I move them into the sauce and let them finish cooking that way. And as some of the water goes into the sauce, don't worry about it. That actually helps thicken it up and makes it really delicious. Many of these recipes are available on my blog over at moonandmagnolia.com, but the best way to get all of my new recipes and posts is to sign up for the email list. I will leave a link for that in the description box below. I hope these recipes today have given you some inspiration and ideas for fitting scratch-made cooking into your days, especially on those days when you have a little more time. Thanks so much for stopping by today, and I will see you again next time.